To kick off training camp, the Seahawks made a splash, locking up one of their foundational players on defense. Rob Rang and I are going to be breaking down the Julian Love extension here on Training Camp Opener on Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang, and a special thanks to all the 12s that are listening in. Going to give some Midwest love here, whether you're tuning in from Churubusco, Indiana, or Plymouth, Michigan. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. The Seahawks kicked off training camp today, ushering in the 2024 season, but they decided to put that first practice as an afterthought with some breaking news locking up one of their foundational players on defense. We're going to dive into a new contract for Julian Love and the Seahawks' rationale for making that deal happen now. Then we'll have our takeaways, offense and defense, what went down at the VMAC at the first training camp practice. And that's brought your way courtesy of Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your purchase. Terms apply. Now for your lead story here on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Training camp opened today, so you would figure that the big story is that the Seahawks are back in the practice field. Well, John Schneider and the Rosenhaus brothers decided to throw everything for a little bit of a curveball. Shortly after Mike Macdonald had his first press conference as head coach following a training camp practice, the Seahawks announced that Julian Love has agreed to a 3-year, $36 million extension. And I'm not going to lie, Rob, this was the guy that you and I mentioned a few times during the offseason that we thought if there's a player who might get an extension early in training camp, as we've seen John Schneider do time and time again during his tenure as general manager, Love was the name that made the most sense because he was a Pro Bowler. He's only 27. And because he can play both safety positions as well as slot corner, that versatility seemed like a great fit in Mike Macdonald's defense. So some fans might wonder why you would give this extension when he hasn't played a game for Mike Macdonald, but clearly Macdonald already has seen enough that he would sign off on this. And now he is under contract through 2027.
Yeah, that's a huge deal for the Seahawks, just because of the fact that Julian Love played as well as he did. You know, I mean, you got to go back a year and remember that this is a guy that was a kind of a surprise signing. And of course, the Seahawks were expecting, Jamal Adams to come back healthy. They were coming off of another quality year from Quandre Diggs. Where did Julian Love fit? And yet, instead, he comes in, he starts 14 of 18 games. He has 123 tackles. He has 10 pass breakups. He has 4 interceptions. As you mentioned, he gets invited to the Pro Bowl in his first season in Seattle. This is exactly the type of player that the Seahawks want to reward. And so they did so here. And as you said, Corbin, a 3-year, $36 million deal. At least that's what's being reported at this point. That's going to put Julian Love firmly in the top 10. So clearly the Seahawks are prioritizing the safety position now with John Schneider and Mike Macdonald, similarly the way that they did with John Schneider and Pete Carroll in the past. But Julian Love is a very different type of a player than what we had previously seen with Diggs and with Jamal Adams, in that it's his versatility, his ability to play just about anywhere in the safety position, strong or free, deep or close to the line of scrimmage. He proved himself to be very, very effective in that way. So I think this is an exciting move. I think that just because, again, Julian Love is a good football player, but also because of the signals that it sends to the rest of the locker room, that if you come in and you play well, then the Seahawks will reward you.
As I just posted, those of you that are watching the show on YouTube, there's a stark difference when you are looking at the games that Julian Love started versus the games that he didn't. He started 12 games. He was coming off the bench in 5 of them. The Seahawks, in those 12 games he started, they went 8-4. So that's a playoff team if he plays every game as a starter based on that track record. They gave up 21.1 points per game. They also had 9 interceptions in those 12 games. Not a great number necessarily, but it's a lot better than the alternative here. And we're talking about the 5 games that Julian Love didn't start for the Seahawks. They gave up 29 points per game in those games and only had 2 interceptions in those 5 contests. And so it's not all on Julian Love, but this seems like a big enough sample size here. And the Seahawks clearly agree with this as well. And you and I were talking about this before the show. I'm sure the Rosenhauses had to show this statistic as well that, hey, look what your team did when our client was a starter for your football team. And I'm sure that played into how simple it was for them to move on from Diggs and Adams this offseason. They needed the financial flexibility, but also you already had a player in-house that was a little bit younger than those 2 players, could play both positions at a very high level, has played some nickel corner, even played some outside corner early in his career with the New York Giants. He led the team in interceptions last year. This is well documented, Rob. We look back at last season, and I felt like the first month or so that Julian Love really struggled. I thought opponents were picking on him quite a bit in coverage. He was missing more tackles than I anticipated. But then you look at those last 6-7 games, and he was arguably Seattle's best defender during that time, and he was playing more snaps as a free safety during that time. So I think with Rayshawn Jenkins now being brought in, he's more suited to play in the box at a larger number of snaps. I think this sets up favorably. You can still move Julian Love around, but he's going to be able to play deeper coverage and really play to his strengths as an athletic, instinctive cover safety. And you can still mix in some blitzes. You can still bring him up into the box some. But this contract clearly states that the Seahawks view him as one of those focal points in Mike Macdonald's scheme, and they expect that his best football is still in front of it.
Yeah, and I love that you just mentioned Rayshawn Jenkins, and because that's who I focused on yesterday. Is one of the players I was most excited to kind of see how the Seahawks were going to use them, and by extension, it was Julian Love, as well as, say a Kobe Bryant, or when he is able to get back onto the field for the Seahawks, Jarek Reed II. But again, I just very encouraged by what I saw from Julian Love a year ago, and love the fact that the Seahawks have retained him in the for the long term with a 3-year deal. I also think that's important to mention some of the other moves that the Seahawks made today and yesterday, right before the official start of training camp here on July 24th, and that was a couple of signings. The Hawaii offensive lineman who has spent some time in the San Francisco 49ers, Arizona Cardinals, and the Carolina Panthers, Ilm Manning. He's a 6'2", 294-pounder, and that suggests a move inside to guard or center, but he started 60 games for Hawaii at left tackle. He also saw some time for the San Francisco 49ers. It's where he's spent most of his NFL time actually on the field in training camp. Was released by Carolina, I believe it was in May. But again, 6'2", 294 pounds. I like his initial quickness. I like his balance in terms of pass protection. And again, his burst and his ability to kind of adjust to moving targets. I think that he's going to be an intriguing addition to this offensive line. Jalen Sundell from North Dakota State is another one. 6'5", 300-pounder who has some left tackle and center experience as well. He was an undrafted free agent out of NDSU, but I also like his positional versatility, and certainly am intrigued by his size. And then last but not least, you got to mention the wide receiver and kick returner Marcus Sims from Michigan Panthers, previously the West Virginia. This is a guy who was, arguably the most explosive wide receiver in all of the UFL a year ago. And it was one touchdown in particular, Corbin, against Houston. And I don't want to spend a lot of time watching UFL football, but one touchdown in particular to me just kind of made me kind of stand up in my seat a little bit that he had. I believe it was a 65-yarder, and he and the corner were basically chest to chest going for the ball. But once that Marcus Sims caught the football, his second gear to accelerate, pull away, and score that touchdown was very impressive, considering the fact that the Seahawks have their concerns that they have, especially in the return game. I think that Marcus Sims is an intriguing sign on basically on the day of training camp as well.
And you mentioned the Manning signing. That was the one that was announced today. Sims yesterday. Sims had actually been reported last week, but they officially signed him yesterday. With these 3 additions, they had 2 roster spots open. So they ended up cutting Tremaine Ankrum, who they signed in March, former Ram. He's not going to get an opportunity to compete for a roster spot at all in training camp. And this strikes me as one of those situations where the team sees a veteran that maybe can make another football team, and they give him a little bit of a pass here. Hey, we're going to get you an opportunity to get on the market now to see if you can get a fair opportunity to compete for a roster spot, because there just wasn't a position for him after drafting Christian Haynes, the emergence of McLennan Curtis. There just wasn't going to be a position for him to make this football team after they signed him back in March. When we come back, it was training camp day number 1 at the VMAC. We're going to dive into some takeaways from the first practice, which felt very OTA and mini camp-ish, but that's typically how you start off training camp. Very similar tempo. We're going to get to what we saw on the offensive side of the football. That'll be coming up next here on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by Game Time. You shouldn't have to think about skipping a mortgage payment when you buy tickets to your next big event. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. My wife and I are soon going to be seeing Atreyu in Wyoming. We were able to get some awesome seats close up to see one of our favorite bands on Game Time for just $12 a ticket. We can't wait for the opportunity to jam with an awesome metal band. If you thought I was going to skip out on that opportunity, you got another thing coming. Game Time has deals on tickets right into the day of the event, and the Game Time guarantee means you'll always get the best price to write your own memories. If you find tickets in the same section and row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Welcome back to the Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s that are listening in. We are loving all the locked-in listeners that are telling us today where you are tuning in from. Much respect to each and every one of you. Thanks for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. Training camp officially kicked off today. As we just talked about, Seattle tried to throw a little bit of a wrench into the situation by announcing Julian Love had agreed to a 3-year extension, but we can't move away from training camp completely here. We got to dive into this first practice, because this is really a holiday for football fans. The chance to finally see your team back on the field. It was the first open training camp practice. A bunch of fans today on the berm with an opportunity to see first glance Mike Macdonald's squad here heading into the 2024 season. And we're going to start with the obvious here, and this is leaning off of what we saw in OTAs. You were in attendance for a few of those practices as well as mini camp, and we've got to see Geno Smith slinging the pigskin. And I know that there's still no contact, and it's still in OTAs, mini camp style practice here, these first couple practices in training camp, but it doesn't matter. When you watch just the precision that Geno Smith is throwing the football with right now, the confidence that he's playing with, it's just on a different level than we saw the last 2 years in training camp. I'm telling you, it just looks like another light switch has clicked for him with the way that he is firing the football. He threw some darts today that probably would have been 95-mile-an-hour fastballs if he was pitching from a mound. I mean, I don't know how the receivers caught a few of them, but he is just playing with great confidence in command. He had 2 touchdowns in a brief red zone session as well. One of them, he lofted up to DK Metcalf. We were talking yesterday how they've struggled with those goal line fades. This was a perfectly thrown goal line fade to DK Metcalf, outstretched arms of Trey Brown, and he could not get to the football. If the Seahawks can do that on game days, that red zone percentage that was so poor last year should instantly go up. Those are the kind of things that were exciting today, just watching from an offensive standpoint and seeing number 7 carve up the defense and run this new offense with great precision.
Yeah, and I'm sure there were a lot of Seahawks fans that were watching or listening yesterday, Corbin. And as you often say, thank you so much to all of our viewers and listeners. But I'm sure there were some that when we listed Geno Smith as the number one player for our top 90 countdown, I'm sure there were some that just kind of rolled their eyes and said, "Hey, he's a solid quarterback. He's not a superstar." And yet, all of the signs that we've seen over the last 2 years, in which, of course, he was voted to the Pro Bowl, and the signs that we've seen over the offseason, all the things that he has said, that Ryan Grubb has said, that Mike Macdonald has said, and then the clips that we have seen of Geno Smith just completely dedicating himself to becoming the best version of himself, an even better player than what we've seen the past couple of seasons. It all suggested that this was going to turn out today the way that it did, with, as you said, and just throwing darts all over the field to a variety of receivers. I read your article on allseahawks.com, and it was, the fact that you mentioned that it wasn't just the touchdown to DK Metcalf, that it was some laser throws to other Seattle wide receivers and tight ends, that to me is very encouraging. And so we've seen the velocity, we've seen the accuracy. Frankly, I'm in Los Angeles. I'm going to be covering 5 different NFL training camps over the next couple of days, and I don't know that I'm going to see any quarterback throw with the accuracy that I've seen Geno Smith show the last couple of days. So I'm not sure that it's news at this point that Geno Smith was spectacular, but still, I think it's got to be very comforting for Seahawks fans who have high expectations for 2024 that Geno Smith was, in fact, spectacular on day one of training camp.
Speaking of high expectations, Jackson Smith-Njigba continues to find ways to take that ceiling up to another notch above the clouds. And in fact, he kind of emulated Golden Tate today. And what I mean by that, Geno Smith lofted up a bomb down the seam. It was actually, I would say that it was a skinny corner route is the way that it ended up looking on the field. And Mike Jackson was in perfect position to make a play on this football. In fact, he had his hands on the football. It looked like he was the first one that had his hands on it for an interception. And Jackson Smith-Njigba did a remarkable job in the middle of the air of pulling the football away from Mike Jackson and coming down with it. The Seahawks have refs. They have actual NFL refs that are at these practices. They're getting in their practice right now. And so this was not a strike official. This was not somebody that was a replacement ref. This is an actual NFL official that ruled it as a catch for Jackson Smith-Njigba. And so it was really cool to see that and see the two guys jawing at each other. It was fun, playful jawing, but they were jawing at each other after it when you got two intense competitors. Mike Jackson is as intense of a competitor as there is on this football team. That's why he's still around. But Jackson Smith-Njigba showing off his toughness and his strength, pulling the football away from Mike Jackson on that 40-plus yard reception, drew a lot of oohs and ahs from the crowd on the berm. He had a couple other really nice catches over the middle on intermediate crossing routes, which is where I think he is going to eat up this year. I don't want to keep putting gas on the flame, but Jackson Smith-Njigba is doing it for me, Rob.
Oh, I understand. And I love that you just mentioned, JSN against Mike Jackson and then previously DK Metcalf against Trey Brown. I mean, just think about the size difference between those wide receivers and the cornerbacks. And it's a testament to Geno Smith's accuracy that he's able to loft that ball to DK. But I mean, let's face it, this is a 6'4" wide receiver as physically built as DK is compared to a 5'10" corner in Trey Brown. Whereas Mike Jackson and JSN both have very similar 6 foot to 6'1", 200-pound frame. So JSN had to make that play and steal the ball, a la Golden Tate against the Green Bay Packers all those years ago. So I love that reference as well. So that's all very encouraging news. And I hate to play the role of kind of Dustin Downer here, but there were some concerns, at least that I've read. Again, I'm in Los Angeles. I was not there at the Seahawks practice. I want to make sure that I'm clear and understandable about that. But some of the things that I read is concerning, and that was specifically with Abe Lucas and the fact that McClendon Curtis, the player that we talked about about before might be in the running for right guard is now suddenly playing some right tackle just because of the fact that Abe Lucas is not yet available. And again, we knew this offseason surgery, but at the same time, it doesn't sound like Abe Lucas is necessarily expected to be back tomorrow or even next week. And so with McClendon Curtis sliding over, and then that's a position that he played at UT Chattanooga, but still, it is UT Chattanooga. It's not the NFL. And so that to me would be the one concern that I had on day one, at least on the offensive side of the ball for the Seahawks training camp opener.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned, not that I'm glad about the reasoning behind it, but I'm glad that you mentioned Abraham Lucas, because the update that Mike Macdonald provided today, it felt too ominous to me. Just to be honest, it didn't have the optimism that I was looking for. And again, I've talked to some people within the organization or team sources with the organization that have gotten an opportunity to see Abe Lucas run around. And it looks like he is ready to roll from that regard. And yet Mike Macdonald making it clear today that, we were hoping that this was going to be sped up a little bit more, that this was going to be a little further ahead of where it is right now. And he even didn't deny the possibility, hey, with where he's at right now, could he miss week one? Hey, that concern is going to be there as long as he's not able to get over the hump. And so the fact that McClendon Curtis was playing right tackle today and Macdonald made it sound like that's where he's going to be at right now because of the needs they have on the roster, that tells you it's Christian Haynes versus Anthony Bradford at right guard. That's the first thing you take from that. But it also tells you this could be a murky situation that quite frankly, we've been trying to be much more optimistic because there's been a lot of reasons for optimism based on the videos Abraham Lucas has posted and the things that I've heard from people linked to his camp that they were optimistic. And maybe we do see him in a week or so here on the field. But the comments that Mike Macdonald made suggest to me that that may not necessarily be the case. And this is something that they are not going to rush. They shouldn't be rushing him back. That's why you signed George Fant. That's why you now have McClendon Curtis playing that position. Stone Forsythe's played some right tackle. You've got some pieces there, but they are not going to force the issue. That being said, you're hoping and praying that Abraham Lucas can get out there sooner rather than later so that he has a chance to be ready to go fully healthy for week one against the Denver Broncos, because this offensive line is just much different without him. We saw it last year. We would see it again in week one against the Broncos at home. So we'll see what happens, but that seemed like an update that wasn't necessarily what Seahawk fans were hoping to hear. If you're looking for a more positive spin on some injuries, don't worry. We got that coming up next here as we look at the defensive side of the football for the Seahawks on our takeaway episode for day one of Seahawks training camp. Don't go away. We'll be right back. This episode of Locked On Seahawks is brought your way by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. It's what brings home the winning trophy. It also keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, whether it's superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, steering wheel covers, whatever you're in the need of, whether it's speed, power, style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time and your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit. Only available to U.S. customers. Welcome back to the Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s listening in. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. Training camp officially upon us. Day one for the Seahawks in the books at the VMAC. We just broke down the offensive side of the football, which, let's be honest, these first few practices, it's OTAs, minicamp style, no contact. You can't play the football aggressively. These rules are all catered for the offense. So you expect the offense to put up some significant numbers, put up big plays. Defense, it's much tougher to evaluate because of those rules restrictions. With that being said, after learning Abraham Lucas may not be as close to returning as what we thought he would be, there was some positive injury news for the Seattle Seahawks. Yesterday, Tyrel Dodson and Jerome Baker passed their physical, and they were removed from the PUP list. I expected to see them weaned back into practice, and yet, Rob, today, I had the ability to go over and watch the linebacker group. I watched the entire team session, obviously, and both Dodson and Baker were active throughout practice. You couldn't really see limitations. And what really had me excited, I posted some clips of this on my social media accounts today from practice. They were both moving really well. They looked spry. They didn't look like they were still working their way back from injuries. They looked 100% healthy. That is the news Seahawks fans were looking with that huge question mark that has been the linebacker position.
Yeah, it was our number one concern throughout the entire offseason, something we talked about so often. And, again, I have a great deal of confidence that if Tyrel Dodson, Jerome Baker are healthy, the Seahawks are going to be just fine at the linebacker position. In fact, I actually think that it's going to be upgraded linebacker play than what the Seahawks saw a year ago. I know that is controversial considering the fact that Bobby Wagner is going to be fitted with a gold jacket here, 5-7 years from now. And of course, Jordan Brooks is a heck of a football player himself. But at the same time, I really think in this particular defense that Mike Macdonald is bringing that you need a absolute just tone setter in the middle, somebody who is going to knock ball carriers to the ground emphatically. And I really believe that Tyrel Dodson can be that. And I think that Jerome Baker, his ability as a pass rusher and definitely in coverage, he's not KJ Wright all over again. KJ Wright to me is one of the most underrated and best coverage linebackers I've ever seen. But when I see Jerome Baker, what I see is a guy who does have the speed and the awareness that you're looking for to be a classic will linebacker. And I just think that that's something that, considering the running backs and the tight ends in this division, the Seahawks have been struggling with in years in the past. So very encouraging news that both of those players were on the field. I will say that some of the pictures I've seen of Jerome Baker, I understand why he's wearing number 17, because my goodness, looks like a defensive back out there. I mean, he's just a thin built guy in comparison to some of the other linebackers. But I don't know I don't mean that necessarily as a knock on Jerome Baker. I mean, his success, 6 years in the NFL, and he was a stud at Ohio State previously as well. I think it's more of just a statement of where the NFL is going, that you don't need these 240, 250, 260 pound linebackers. You need guys who can turn and run and play coverage, and Jerome Baker can do that. So again, to me, that was very encouraging news that both of them were on the field. I thought that it was interesting that Mike Macdonald name dropped Lance Boykin, who also was on the field after previously being, I believe, on the PUP list. I thought the PUP list of the NFI, but was not likely to be available a couple of days ago for training camp, and now is back on the field for the Seahawks. And I was really encouraged what the Coastal Carolina product had shown in terms of just his length and his ball skills previously as well. So some very encouraging news on the defensive side of the ball on day one for the Seahawks training camp.
Yeah, much different than the offensive line situation with Abe Lucas. You've got your two main linebackers back in action. And again, I was expecting to see these guys weaning into action. And yeah, on the team sessions, I'm sure they could have done more reps when they are, have their legs underneath them, but they were really out there for most of the practice. And so that was a lot more than I was anticipating. And maybe that's just the case that these 3 weeks here, maybe they were close to being back when OTAs and mini camps were wrapping up and Seattle just held it safe. These guys are ready to go. As far as the secondary, you mentioned Lance Boykin, and obviously had a pass breakup today. Mike Macdonald, unprompted, had to mention that when he was talking about players coming off injury. But one thing that we've known from the Pete Carroll era is that they've had some really talented corners. There's no question about that. But Pete Carroll had the philosophy that he did not want to move his top corners and move them across the field and travel with receivers. And Mike Macdonald was asked today about his viewpoint on that. And he made it clear right now that they're just going to be doing right side, left side. Guys are going to be on one side and they're going to be learning the defense in that capacity. But he also made it clear that it depends on opponent. And you look back at Baltimore's film, they certainly had games where they moved Marlon Humphrey around the field some. They'd get him in slot. They'd move him at both sides in the boundary. They'd move Brandon Stevens last year around. Guy they moved from safety to corner. So there will be opponents where we're going to see a change of guard in that regard, that the Seahawks are going to be willing to move guys around. And I almost wonder if Pete Carroll was starting to open up more to that last year, because Devin Witherspoon forced his hand with his ability to play all over the field. But Macdonald has a history of doing that. There are games where he'll stick left and right, but there are also games where they'll mix and match. There's games where they will travel their top corner with the elite receiver on the other side. And so I think that is a refreshing thing for Seattle's secondary, because I think that was one of the things that really held this secondary back, especially giving up explosive plays in the last 4 or 5 years. The rest of the NFL caught on with what the Seahawks were doing. They didn't have the Legion of Boom anymore. And I think that's one of the things that really stagnated their defensive attack, is not being able to do that, or not being willing to move your elite corners with the best receivers. And you saw opponents take advantage of that.
You really did. I think it's just the evolution of defense in the NFL. I've stumbled over Mike Macdonald's name so many times. I've called him Mark. I've called him McDaniel. I've called him just about everything. It's maybe the M of Mike Macdonald should just be multiple, because that's exactly what I think that he is going to bring to the Seahawks defense. And I love the fact that you mentioned just how the corners are going to be more multiple. They're going to be more diverse and more versatile. They're going to be able to line up on both sides when necessary, but at the same time, also just recognizing that Reek Woolen, Devin Witherspoon, Trey Brown, your expected starters, perhaps Mike Jackson. Still, you're talking about 3 or 4 corners that are all 27 years old or younger. And so these are relatively inexperienced players that you want to be able to allow them to develop some comfort on one side of the field before you get too cute. Excuse me. Now, Devin Witherspoon is just a different level of instincts. I still have a hard time believing just how aware that he is, given the fact that a lot of his high school career was played on the basketball court rather than on the football field. I mean, he is just, 1 in a million in that regard. But for a player like, say, Reek Woolen specifically, a guy who, didn't play as much high school football like Witherspoon, and then when he did play in high school and college, some of it was at the wide receiver position. You got to have, just take care of the young player and allow them to succeed in one role before you try to get too cute and have them play in multiple roles. I'm encouraged by the teaching, the coaching, and the enthusiasm that we see in Mike Macdonald in his very first practice here as the head coach of the Seattle Seahawks.
Yeah, I think that the idea that players like Woolen, who maybe are not as advanced with the defensive terminology, those are guys that there's nothing wrong with specialization. There's been plenty of good corners that have been able to do that. But when you have players that you can move around successfully, and it gives you the flexibility, if you're playing against, say, a CeeDee Lamb or one of the elite receivers in the NFL, Justin Jefferson, who they're going to see later this season, where you can say, look, Devin Witherspoon, you are going wherever Justin Jefferson goes. We're going to have you move wherever he is on the field, and you're defending. Or Reek Woolen, we now trust you to be able to do this. Left, right, slot, wherever. You are going to be following Justin Jefferson. That gives you a lot more flexibility with your playbook. It creates some other avenues that you can go in terms of your pressure packages, where you mix and match guys. So from a mad scientist perspective, if you can get most of your secondary players to be able to move around some like that and travel with receivers and be able to do some mixing and matching, it really does play into that mad scientist mentality that we know Mike Macdonald craves. Last thing that I want to mention here real quick, when we're talking pass breakups, normally it would be the players that we just mentioned. It'd be Devin Witherspoon, it'd be Reek Woolen, it would be Trey Brown, Mike Jackson and company. But something that we have talked about a little bit this offseason, over the course of the offseason, is how Seattle's interior defenders in particular were able to make an impact rushing the passer without getting sacks. And a lot of it had to do with getting their big paws up and knocking passes down. And then on the edge, Boye Mafe, I believe, had 4 or 5 of those last year, swatting passes down. The only way they could stop Geno Smith today was getting their hands up in the passing lane. And Jaron Reed had a swatted pass. Draymond Jones had one. Boye Mafe had one. They were tipping passes left and right. And I feel like that is such an underrated part of great defensive play in the NFL or at any level for that matter, but particularly the NFL. If you want to be able to fluster quarterbacks and you want to be able to get off the field, you're not always going to get home. So you got to be able to get those hands up so that you can get them into passing lanes and try to see if you can get some easy incompletions by swatting balls down at the line of scrimmage.
Yeah, and preach, brother. I've been saying this for a while now. In today's NFL, the ball is out so darn quick that I think that the big defensive linemen have got to be better about getting their hands up. Now, I understand from an offensive line, that's what the position I played. And when I saw a big defensive lineman put his hands up, then I punched him in the belly to make sure that he recognized that you don't want to do that too often against me. But at the same time, I do think that it's critical, especially on money downs, when you know it's going to be a short little 3 or 4, 5 yard route, then get those hands up in the air. It's such an relatively easy opportunity to flip the downs and get the ball back, or even create a turnover possibility. And so to me, that was one of the things, as much as I believe that Pete Carroll was a phenomenal coach and absolutely should be in the Hall of Fame someday, the fact that Seattle's defensive linemen did not create as more turnovers than they did, to me, is always something that kind of just stuck in my craw a little bit. I always thought that was something they could have improved upon.
As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. When we come back tomorrow, we're going to have more takeaways, day 2 from Seahawks training camp, diving into what we saw on offense and defense. And who knows, maybe there'll be another contract extension, or maybe Connor Williams will become a Seahawk. We'll just have to wait and see, but we'll be breaking it all down here on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. So make sure you're listening in and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Go Hawks.